Hi, I'm Jenna French and I'm a behavior analyst with Northeast Metro 916. Today I'm going to be talking about the background, the history, the basic principles of applied behavior analysis in my training called What is ABA Anyway? So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation with you all. Okay. And here it is. What is ABA anyway? An introduction to applied behavior analysis. The objectives for today, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the history of behaviorism and kind of how applied behavior analysis is used today. We'll talk about different specialties within the field of behavior analysis. I'm going to go over some basic concepts of applied behavior analysis to give you a background on kind of the principles that we use when we are making recommendations for behavior change. We'll talk a little bit more about what behavior analysts actually do, and then discuss the role of behavior analysts in schools. So to start with a brief history, behavior analysis emerged in the early 1900s. This was around the same time that other psychologists were making huge gains in the field of psychology. I have on here Piaget and Freud. Freud is probably one that you're all familiar with. But the psychologists that were really leading the field, their primary focus was on the mind, things that happened internally or developmentally. And so when John Watson came along in the early 1900s, he shifted the focus to interactions that we can see. And here it talks about the observation of the relationships between environmental stimuli and the response that they evoke. So an example of what that could look like is, if I'm taking a walk out in the park and I see a stick in my way on the path and I step over the stick. So the stimuli in the environment was the stick being present on the ground, and my response that was evoked from that was that I stepped over it so that I didn't trip. And then along comes our BFF, B.F. Skinner. He's probably one of the most commonly talked about behaviorists. He made huge gains in the field. There are other people, obviously, who also helped to contribute to the field of behavior analysis, but Skinner is definitely one of the primary behaviorists that we talk about a lot, and that was very influential in our field. In 1938, he began writing about conditioning. So there are two different types of conditioning. One is learned and one is unlearned. The respondent conditioning is not learned. It's more of an association between a stimulus and our biological response. And that was something that Pavlov studied with the salivating dogs. If those of you with psychology backgrounds might be familiar with that. And then there's also operant conditioning. And that's how we learn, using those ABCs, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So here, our actions might be elicited by a stimulus, but they're maintained or reduced by the consequence that follows our behavior. And he still had an emphasis on observable events. So looking at the relationship of all three of those components in order to see how we learn and why we learn. A common misconception about, I think, behavior analysis in general, but this is directly related to Skinner. Although the primary focus of behaviorism is to study the connection between observable behavior and the environment, Skinner did not object to cognitive psychology's concern with private events, so the events taking place inside the skin. Skinner was one of the first behaviorists to view thoughts and feelings as behavior to be analyzed with the same conceptual and experimental tools used to analyze publicly observable behavior. So again, our primary focus is on that observable behavior, but we do not discount the internal activities and private events that go on maybe in our mind or in our bodies. And then that brings us to behaviorism today. So over time, behaviorism has grown and evolved. I skipped past quite a bit of history, but I just wanted to kind of give you the basic kind of foundation that behaviorism was built on. The most common form of behaviorism today is applied behavior analysis, or ABA, which focuses on the understanding and improvement of human behavior. ABA is the most is most widely known as an intervention for individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, but it has several subspecialties. So I'm going to go through each of those subspecialties. The first one is autism and intellectual or developmental disabilities, and that's where behavior analysts work to improve cognitive, language, social, and self-help skills in those individuals. The second subspecialty has to do with sports, which I thought was interesting. The sports psychology, in that field, they work with athletes, teams, and coaches to teach new skills, decrease persistent errors, decrease problem behavior, maximize competition performance, teach coaching techniques, promote healthy diet and exercise, and then increase or improve motivation, thinking, emotions, confidence, and concentration with regard to athletic performance. The third one listed here is clinical behavior analysis, and that is when behavior analysts work with teams of mental health professionals to address different problems such as anxiety, depression, stress, relationship discord, substance misuse, chronic pain, disruptive behavior, impulsivity, inattention, tic disorders, and sleep disturbance. And all of this information comes from fact sheets from the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, which I will talk about in a little bit. But one of the quotes on there was that with regard to clinical behavior analysis, interventions involve understanding clients' thoughts, feelings, and actions, all of which are viewed as behavior that must be understood in context. So that was just kind of cool to read, and again, went along with that quote about Skinner that I shared previously. The fourth one on the list is organizational behavior management. That's where behavior analysts work with various industries, companies, businesses to improve the work environment and employee performance. The fifth one there, behavioral gerontology. That's where behavior analysts work with seniors and care staff to improve the quality of life and care services of those seniors, to decrease challenging behaviors, maintain daily living skills, implement memory and language programs, work on medical adherence or adhering to a schedule for medication, and then prolonging independence of those individuals. Let's see, and then we've got brain injury rehabilitation. So that's where the behavior analyst would again work with a multidisciplinary team to either work on some skill acquisition or behavior reduction for individuals with brain injuries. And here, some of the skill acquisition targets they can work on are improving social interactions for their ability to return to work. And then behavior reduction, for example, decreasing aggression or decreasing inappropriate vocalizations. We've got education, where behavior analysts can improve teaching and learning across content areas, grade levels, and the student population. They can work on academic, social, vocational, and daily living skills in this setting. Environmental sustainability was an interesting one that I came across. Here's where behavior analysts work with experts and policymakers to improve sustainable practices, such as environmental conservation and preservation, energy use and renewable energy, pollution, emission control and transportation, food production, consumption, and waste, recycling and waste reduction, consumer education, and political action. There's also prevention and intervention in child maltreatment. That's where behavior analysts focus on parent-child interactions, increasing home safety and child health care. They do planned activity training, and they promote the achievement of developmental norms in children as they grow. Then there's health and fitness. That's where behavior analysts might team with healthcare professionals, registered dietitians, and personal trainers to improve individuals' personal health and fitness. And then last but not least, the treatment of substance abuse disorders, And then in this subspecialty, behavior analysts use evidence-based interventions to prevent and treat misuse of both licit and illicit drugs. And again, they work on that multidisciplinary team. So with all that said, I'll go ahead and just let that sink in for you. It was really interesting seeing all these subspecialties because I didn't even know that there were that many applications of behavior analysis. So my mind was certainly blown. All right. So what is ABA anyway? The technical definition is that applied behavior analysis is a scientific approach for discovering environmental variables that reliably influence socially significant behavior and for developing a technology of behavior change that takes practical advantage over those discoveries. That is a mouthful, and it requires a little bit of unpacking. So in a nutshell, ABA allows us to identify and determine patterns in human behavior. ABA uses evidence-based strategies and techniques to promote socially significant behavior change. Now, this image on the right, I thought was really helpful in breaking down the basic tenets of applied behavior analysis. The first one is measurable. Any behavior that we're looking to change needs to be measurable. The only way we can truly tell if it has changed is if we measure it and we collect that data. Socially significant. The other piece in behavior change is that it needs to be meaningful. It needs to be socially significant for that individual, for their family, their caregivers. And I thought that this was a really interesting shift in psychology. My undergraduate degree is in psychology. And when you were reading studies, those large psychological studies where they've had huge group sizes that they're maybe testing different hypotheses with, you look for statistical significance. So is that change or is that information that they gathered, is it statistically significant? And then you can prove that, yep, this is an effective therapy or study. With behavior analysis, we look for social significance. Even the smallest change can be really socially significant. And so that's really helpful in determining whether or not our strategies are effective and useful for the general public. Another component is research. So we do rely very heavily on research, and we look for those evidence-based practices that we can recommend and use with different students or clients. Data, which I talked about, making sure that we are looking at the measurements that we collect and monitoring that data maybe in a graph so that we can see if the intervention that we have in place is effective. Making meaningful change. So that's important, just like the socially significant behavior changes. And then working on generalization. So not just helping someone acquire a skill, but then helping them be able to use that skill in the natural environment and be able to generalize across situations. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the basic principles of ABA. The first one is behavior. Behavior is anything a person does. It must be measurable, observable, and pass the dead man's test. And that's where the saying goes, if a dead man can do it, it's not behavior. So when we think about that dead man's test, which is an interesting way to put it, we think about behavior as something that's actionable. So sitting, standing, running, raising your hand, writing, talking, laughing, blinking, those are all behaviors. The next example kind of highlights the difference between where the dead man's test ends and then behavior begins. So although being knocked down by a strong wind is not behavior, a dead man would also be blown over. Moving arms and hands in front of one's face, tucking and rolling and yelling, whoa, as one is being blown over are behaviors. So that's the difference there. And then just a fun side note, the dead man's test was tested in a study by Critchfield and Shue in 2018. And it's a very interesting article to read. They assign target behaviors to mummies. and then put in some antecedent interventions and do some observations, collect some data to determine whether the dead man's test is actually a reliable way to define behavior. And the results showed that it is very promising that the dead man's test is accurate. So some other basic concepts of ABA. Behavior is influenced by variables in our environment. I talked about that a little bit previously, but here I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about antecedents and consequences. An antecedent is what happens before the behavior. It might elicit or prompt the behavior, and it makes the behavior more likely to occur. The consequence is what happens after the behavior. So in our day-to-day, general language, the word consequence has a negative connotation. In ABA, it doesn't. It simply means the event that happened after the behavior. So it's not always negative. But whatever follows the behavior, the consequence, can make the behavior more or less likely to happen again in the future. And that's the important part. That's what we look at. And that brings us to the three-term contingency. So putting together antecedents, behaviors, and consequences in that sequence to show how the antecedents and the consequences might impact our behavior. In these examples, the first antecedent, I see a stop sign while driving. The behavior is I stop my car, and the consequence is I don't get in an accident, and I also don't get a ticket. The second example, the antecedent is my arm itches. So my behavior is I scratch my arm, and the consequence is my arm no longer itches. In the third example, I'm talking with friends, I tell a joke, and my friends laugh. And then the fourth example is I'm at an ice cream shop, I ask for strawberry ice cream, and I get strawberry ice cream, and I also pay the cashier. So there's a little bit more to that one. So thinking about those examples, I want to talk about the functions of behavior. And if you watched my previous training, I also went through those functions. But I think that this meme illustrates them very effectively. All behavior serves a function, just like everybody eats. And EATS is the acronym that I like to use to remember the functions of behavior. So the E stands for escape, which you can see in the top left. The cat looks like it's hiding, trying to escape from whoever is looking at it. The A stands for attention. So here the cat is meowing very loudly to get some attention. The T stands for tangible. Now, tangible could be anything that's preferred. It could be a preferred item. It could be a preferred activity. Here in the bottom left illustration, the tangible is the mouse. So the cat is going to go after that mouse. And then the last one is sensory, or what we call automatic reinforcement. That's something that feels good to us that we can do to ourselves. So scratching my arm when it itches, or rubbing my head when I have a headache. Those are examples of automatic or sensory reinforcement. And here the cat is scratching itself on the pole. So putting it all together, back to the examples that I shared, stopping at the stop sign is escape avoidance from getting in that accident. So that's the function of that behavior. When my arm itches and I scratch it, the scratch goes away. So that's automatic reinforcement, or that sensory piece that I talked about. The third example, when I talk to my friends and tell them a joke and they laugh, that's attention. And then the ice cream shop example is an example of tangible for the function of my behavior there. So another basic principle of ABA is reinforcement. Now, there are different types of reinforcement that I'm going to go over, but the main takeaway for reinforcement is that it always increases the likelihood that the behavior will happen again in the future. So think about reinforcement, increases behavior. There are different types of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement, which is adding something that the individual likes. There's negative reinforcement, which is taking away something the individual doesn't like. And then there's automatic reinforcement. That doesn't require the presence of another person. It just feels good to that individual. It can also be positive or negative. So when I talk about positive and negative, again, I'm not talking about good and bad. I'm talking about adding or taking away. So that's why I put the plus sign by positive and the minus sign by negative, just to illustrate that positive means I'm giving something that they like, negative means I'm taking away something that they don't like. So I thought this meme illustrated positive and negative reinforcement pretty well. So in the top example, the two moms are talking, and one of the moms says, simple, whenever he starts crying, just give him his teddy. And so here, the mom is negative or negatively reinforced by her behavior, because when she gives the child the teddy, the crying stops. And so it removes the stimulus that she doesn't like. Now here at the bottom, the two babies are talking, and one says, dude, how'd you do it? And the other one says, oh, it's easy, just start crying. Mom gives me a teddy every time. So his behavior is positively reinforced. He is given something that he likes in response to his crying, and so he's more likely to cry again. So one last thing about reinforcement, I wanted to share some examples of different types of reinforcement that we might encounter in our daily lives. So positive reinforcement, receiving a paycheck, ordering a meal at a restaurant and then getting that meal, receiving a compliment on an outfit, flipping a light switch, or laughter after telling a joke. Negative reinforcement could be turning up the thermostat when it's cold. We're reducing that heat or taking away that feeling of cold. Taking aspirin for a headache, giving a crying baby a pacifier, makes the crying stop, closing the blinds before taking a nap, and stopping at a stop sign. So all those behaviors are negatively reinforced. And then automatic reinforcement, scratching your arm when it itches, taking deep breaths, stretching, rubbing your head when you have a headache, or fidgeting. Those are all examples of automatically reinforced behaviors. So we talked about how reinforcement increases behavior. Now we're going to talk about the strategies that decrease behavior. Behavior can be decreased through two methods. The first one I'll talk about is extinction. That's when the reinforcer for the behavior is no longer delivered. So let's go back to the baby and the teddy bear example. If the baby starts crying and the mom stops giving him the teddy bear, that's extinction. And so we'll kind of talk about the behavioral response when extinction is happening. But that's an example of just extinction in and of itself. The second way that we can reduce behavior is through punishment. Again, it can be positive. So positive punishment would be introducing something that the individual doesn't like, or negative, which would be taking away something that the individual does like. So I did highlight two examples here. An example of positive punishment would be stepping on a Lego that got left on the floor. Stepping on a Lego hurts really bad. And so that would, that positive punishment would make me less likely to leave Legos on the floor in the future. It's going to decrease that behavior. And then an example of negative punishment is loss of privilege for not doing a chore. So maybe I don't get my TV time because I didn't make my bed in the morning. So that's an example there. A few words about punishment. Punishment with regards to the behavior analyst ethical code, we need to exhaust all reinforcement-based options before we implement punishment procedures to decrease behaviors. And this is also why we conduct FBAs, and FBA stands for Functional Behavior Assessment, and that's where we look at all of the variables that are impacting behavior, and then that helps us determine the function that the behavior serves for the individual, so we can replace that problem behavior with a more appropriate way for that student or individual to have their needs met. So a little bit more detail about extinction. So back to the teddy bear example, when the mom stops giving the child the teddy bear when he cries, what will happen is when the reinforcement of the behavior stops, if you look at that bell curve, the behavior is going to or is likely to increase either in frequency, in duration, how long it lasts, or in intensity until it reaches a point of extinction burst, where it is kind of reached its peak, and then it will decrease afterwards. Now, with extinction, we do want to keep in mind a couple of things. The first one is that it's not recommended to just use extinction alone. Anytime I would recommend taking this approach, I also recommend finding a replacement behavior, teaching that replacement behavior, and prompting it so that the student has an alternative way to have that same need met. The second thing that you want to keep in mind is that if there are any safety concerns involved, especially when anticipating an extinction burst, that might not be the route that you want to take. And so keeping in mind too the safety component when putting together an intervention. So this visual kind of puts everything together that I just talked about with regard to increasing or decreasing behavior. So let's start with behavior. If it's desirable, we would either want to give positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, kind of depending on the context. If it's undesirable, we use extinction or punishment. So that just kind of illustrates all of those components there. So how does ABA promote behavior change? We use information about the antecedents, behaviors, and maintaining consequences or reinforcement to determine interventions that might prevent the occurrence of the behavior, that might prompt or elicit new or alternative behaviors, that teach new skills, whether it's communication, social, vocational, or daily living skills, interventions that increase independence for individuals, and also reinforce desired behaviors while avoiding the reinforcement for undesired behaviors. But how do we get all that information? Through data collection. So data collection is really important, especially in the assessment and intervention for applied behavior analysis. Data can help us in several ways. I've listed a few below. It can help us identify patterns related to time of day, activities, people that are present, just finding different correlations in when the behavior occurs and what else is going on when the behavior occurs. We can see how often a behavior is happening or how long it lasts. That's some important information, and that also gives us something to compare when we do put an intervention in. We can look, is the frequency of that behavior decreasing, or the amount of time that they engage in that behavior, is that decreasing? So that's helpful to have that information. Data collection helps us assess the function of behavior. It also helps us identify areas of need and prioritize target behaviors. So once we have all of this information, we can say, okay, the first behavior we want to target here is elopement. Let's start with just having them staying in the classroom. And then once they're in the classroom, we can build on the next behavior and the next behavior. So the data collection helps us have a little clearer vision of what our top priority is and then what our goals are moving forward. Data also helps us determine if an intervention is working or if it's not working, and we need to go back to the drawing board. And there are several more applications of data collection, but those are some of the more common forms or purposes of data collection. So a little bit more on data. I really liked this quote, especially with regard to data collection and functional behavior assessments. So here it says, understanding why a behavior occurs, or its function, often suggests how it can be changed for the better. On the other hand, premature efforts to treat problem behavior before seeking an understanding of the purpose it serves for a person can be inefficient, ineffective, and even harmful. So what this quote made me think about was the fact that we might see similar behavior across students, but it might serve different purposes for those students. And so having that data collection piece is going to be essential in helping us make the best decision for those individual students. So who practices ABA? The Behavior Analyst Certification Board is a national organization that oversees the certification of practitioners in the field of ABA. There are 4 different types of certification. The first one is BCBAD, which is doctorate level board certified behavior analyst. And there's BCBA, which is a board certified behavior analyst, and they need to have a master's degree to be eligible for that certification. BCABA, which is board certified assistant behavior analyst, requires a bachelor's degree, and then registered behavior technician, which requires a high school diploma. So in addition to meeting the education requirements, there's also a like supervised field work or some type of supervision experience that needs to be obtained. And then those individuals also need to pass the test that's associated with that credential in order to be eligible for certification. So what do behavior analysts do? I talked a little bit about the history, the basic principles, the different types of subspecialties and certifications in the field, but what do behavior analysts do without all of the sciencey jargon that we tend to throw out? Behavior analysts build relationships. They learn about the individual. They try to figure out what the individual likes. They follow their lead. They also want to, it's called pairing with reinforcement, but building that relationship, showing them that when the behavior analyst is around, good things happen. And they work on kind of getting to know the individual and what they like and dislike. They focus on the individual. So again, we're looking for socially significant behavior change. So we're going to look at what that individual needs. What would be most helpful to them to be more successful in the natural environment or access more reinforcement in the natural environment. We teach new skills, and this can be a variety of skills. When I worked in an early intervention autism clinic, we worked on different skills like daily living, like self-care routines, brushing teeth, getting dressed, toilet training, tying shoes. I worked with kiddos on learning different social skills, how to initiate greetings or return greetings, how to play interactively with different kids or different toys. So we can teach a variety of skills, and then we can also do vocational skills, classroom readiness skills, all those things. We also work to improve communication. So again, a lot of interventions might revolve around the student asking or using a picture or using their augmentative communication device to tell staff what they need or what they want. Behavior analysts also break skills down. So a lot of times our ultimate goal for students or clients or individuals, it takes a lot of steps in order to get there. And so behavior analysts are able to break those skills down into smaller, more discrete steps that then the individual can start putting together and building upon in order to achieve that end behavior goal. Behavior analysts also celebrate small improvements. So again, when those behavior goals require a lot of steps or require a lot of small behavior changes in order to reach that goal, we reward and we celebrate each of those small steps towards that ultimate goal. Behavior analysts rely on data. I talked about the importance of data collection earlier, but really when we are looking at behavior change or behavior change over time, we're going to be looking back at that data. Behavior analysts also use evidence-based practices. So things that we recommend, things that we look into for the students we might work with or for clients, we make sure that there's an evidence base behind it before we would recommend it. Behavior analysts also look for patterns. We try to figure out any correlation between the antecedents and consequences that might be impacting a behavior. Based on those patterns, we can identify a function and then find a better alternative. What's a better way for this individual to have that need met? What's a good replacement behavior? We also put it all together. So when we put an intervention together, we might pull in some antecedent strategies. We're going to pull in some teaching strategies to help teach or help the individual learn the replacement behavior or the new skill. And then we're going to pull in some consequence strategies, some different types of reinforcement, things that based on the evidence-based strategies that we have or based on the individual's preferences will help make them more likely to both learn and use that new skill that we are teaching them. And then we also train caregivers and staff. So again, to help with that generalization piece, as an individual is learning a new skill, we might have caregivers and staff also prompt or teach or collect data on that skill, maybe reinforcing the new behavior to again promote that generalization and independence. Behavior analysts in schools. So I really liked this quote from an article called Applied Behavior Analysis in Special Education, Misconceptions and Guidelines for Use. And I would highly recommend reading that article. It was very, very helpful to read, especially in kind of connecting the commonalities between education and behavior analysis. But ABA is not a specific set of interventions for students with ASD. Rather, ABA is a scientific approach to teaching and learning that could be useful for teaching academic, social, and other skills to a wide range of learners. So behavior analysts in schools, a lot of this will overlap with the information that I shared previously. But again, we build relationships. We work to get to know the students that we serve. We might ask questions about them. What do they like? What do they dislike? What does their behavior look like? We really want to get to know that individual. We rely on data. I'm sure that you've been asked to collect data on something, whether it's an academic goal or behavior. But on a daily basis, it's really important to have that information to look at when we're recommending behavior or interventions to make behavior change. In schools, behavior analysts also consult. They might meet with a teacher to talk about a behavior of concern. They might step into the classroom to observe a student, and then they might meet with the teacher afterwards and make some recommendations. In schools, behavior analysts also motivate. They try to find the items, activities, privileges that will help motivate a student to engage in a new or different behavior. We also look for patterns, and that is the FBA process that we follow. We find the patterns of behavior so that we can find a better alternative or replacement behavior that we can recommend for the student. We put it all together. So again, when I talked about taking those antecedent strategies, the teaching strategies, the consequence strategies, we can put all of that together in a behavior intervention plan and then help staff learn how to implement that plan and collect that data. We collaborate. So we might work with a team on an evaluation, help coach with IEP goals, or just make general recommendations for strategies that teachers or education staff can try. And then we also communicate. So we might attend meetings like evaluation meetings, IEP meetings, child study meetings, and then we do some staff training as well. And finally, behavior analysts in schools, we follow our ethical guidelines. So there is an ethics code that I have linked on here through the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. Behavior analysts also monitor problem behavior and behavior incidents. So we might take a look at the school-wide data there. Behavior analysts can make individual student and classroom management recommendations, so we have some tips there. Behavior analysts can also work with PBIS and MTSS systems. So PBIS is positive behavior intervention and support. And then MTSS is multi-tiered systems of support. And then at the very bottom, there's a behavior analysts in education fact sheet from the Behavior Analyst Certification Board. So each of those subspecialties that I talked about has a fact sheet that goes along with it from that BACB website. That was really helpful to read. So that was a lot of information. If you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I will also have a PDF copy of this presentation available for you to look over whenever you like. So thank you very much.